Chapter 13, The Road to War. Don't you find it a little bit ironic that Chapter 13 only contains 13 pages? It's one of the shortest chapters in the text. However, it contains an awful lot of background information. And as I pointed out to you, you can't just study the things that go on in the state of Kentucky, because things that are going on in Indiana and California and Washington, D.C. will affect Kentucky. So even though the chapter starts at the beginning of the War of 1861 and takes us all the way through to August of 62, I'm going to back up a little bit and give you the background information all at one time. Now, your text mentions that between 1854 and 1860, there were sectional disputes. Well, I call the 1850s the turbulent 1850s because there are plenty of sectional disputes. And we've reached the end of confrontation, and we're starting to be confrontational. The end of compromise, I'm sorry. And we're going to be confrontational. Because our country's growing by leaps and bounds. All that territory we acquired in the Louisiana Purchase and the war with Mexico, they're meeting the federal requirements to become states, and they're requesting to come into the Union as a new state. But the problem comes up, all this new territories coming in, are they going to come in as a free state or a slave state? And part of that problem is the territory of Nebraska. Now, this is a map, of course, of 1860, and this is all the Kansas-Nebraska territory. The bottom part of the Nebraska territory is called the Kansas territory. Then, of course, what will later become Oklahoma is an unorganized territory. Really a lot of Indian problems here. But this area right here is the problem that's going to cause some problems. That's a redundancy, but it's the area that's going to cause problems. Nebraska and Kansas geographically is very, very flat. I lived in Kansas for a number of years, and believe me, I know it is flat. Now, you get over here into eastern Kansas along the Missouri border, and it's not quite as flat. And in this area right here, they even have some creeks and what they call little molehill mountain type things. But it's basically flat and hot and windy. But as I said, the country's growing. And part of the problem is because we are growing and we're becoming successful. We're not totally industrialized, but we're making more manufactured goods all the time, and we have agriculture, and we need to figure out some way to get it across the country. Sure, you can put it on a ship and ship it down around South America, but that takes a long time. You've got to fight hurricanes and pirates, and the insurance rates are astronomical. Or you could put it on a wagon train or mule train and take it across the country. But you still have geography and mountains and Indians and bandits, and it still takes a while. So after a little bit of thought, they came up with a brilliant idea. Well, we're using canals and railroads back east. Why don't we have a railroad going from one coast to the other? Well, that's a marvelous idea. But where are you going to start it? Well, New Orleans is a little old port down here off the Gulf of Mexico. Says you need to start it here and take it all the way across the southern United States into California, because we have access to all this big Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. Chicago says, no. What we need to do is this growing industrial city here on the Great Lakes. We have access to the Great Lakes, the Hudson River. We have access to canals that take us to New York and railroads. We'd be best to start it in Chicago, take it down through Illinois, Missouri, across Kansas into California. Oh, that's great, but this is an unorganized territory. We need to do something to make it a state. So in 1854, Senator Douglas of Illinois proposed something called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which would split Nebraska into two territories and let Kansas come in as a state. But then we have another little problem, you see. Look at this. Here is what's Kansas, and here's Missouri. Now, what if Kansas votes to come in as a free state? Do you think the slave state of Missouri is going to like that? Because then she's going to have Illinois as a free state, and Kansas will be a free state. She would not like having free states on both sides of her. She would really prefer that Kansas come in as a slave state. Well, that's that's going to create problems because we have a lot of people in the northern part of Kansas that are from the north. And it's not that they're really opposed to slavery. They just never had any need for it. A lot of them are German families, and they've got large families, and they don't need a slave. And the crops that you're going to grow in Kansas are not as labor intensive as in the South, so you don't need that many workers. But Kansas is going to be pivotal. And Missouri is determined, so they start sending people in from Missouri to vote. And Kansas wound up with two governments, one pro-slavery and one anti-slavery. We began to have people raiding different towns. The pro-slavers would raid the anti-slavers, and then they would in turn around and do something different. Enter John Brown. Now, John Brown, called an abolitionist, and this is a picture of what he really looks like. I'll show you a picture in a minute of what the vision of him was by others. And I have no doubt that people have visions. But since this is a Kentucky history class, we're not going to spend time on beliefs and visions or too much time on John Brown, other than the fact that he had a vision, that his vision was to lead the black slaves to freedom. So he left back east and went out to Kansas to work, and although he was basing himself out of Kansas, he was raiding into Missouri, and he was liberating, shall we say, goods from the slave owner. He would liberate properties from the slave owner's stores. He actually freed very few slaves, but he became known as a hero in the North because someone was doing something about the dreadful slavery issue in the South. Of course, the people in the South thought he was an agent of the North. So while he's out working in Kansas and Missouri, he has another vision. This vision told him to go back east and to take his little army with him and go to a place called Harper's Ferry. Now, I have trouble believing that God gives specific directions, like go to Harper's Ferry, but this is a federal arsenal, and his idea was to go there and capture the arsenal, have plenty of guns, and as soon as the slaves heard that there was guns available, they would flock to him, and he would lead them to freedom. Of course, the irony is that the first person to die in his attempt to take the Harper's Ferry was a free black man who was trying to stop him. Well, he managed to capture it, but to make a long story short, their Marines found out about it, and a young colonel by the name of Robert E. Lee managed to take him prisoner. They arrested him, and of course there was a trial. He was tried for crimes against the state and found guilty, and he was hung for his crimes. Like I say, the South saw the whole thing as a plot to overturn slavery, and the North saw him as an avenging angel. But no matter how you look at it, Kansas, who got the nickname of Bleeding Kansas, even though it was supposed to be a debate over whether she was going to come in free or slave, her status, it turned out to be a little mini preview of the upcoming conflict in about 5 years. Now, this did not happen in Kentucky. It did not supposedly affect Kentucky, other than the fact that we are a slaveholding state. And we looked with interest and watched the events unfold and wondered what's next. Meanwhile, our own Kentucky John Breckinridge, a lawyer, had been elected to the House of Representatives, and he was going to become the voice of the pro-slavery and Southern rights. He ran successfully for 2 terms, then decided not to run for the 3rd time, and what he wanted to do was return to Louisville, his plantation, and raise horses. But being the man that he was nominated to be vice president with Buchanan in 1856. And he chose to run and was elected. So we, like I said, we're so high on everything. We've got national known politicians. Even though Clay has left the scene, his reputation is still here. We've got agriculture, we've got property, we've got, you name it, and we've got it here. And we're nationally known, we're respected. And I firmly believe that had there not been a war, that John Breckinridge would have been our next president. But that's a little game that we historians like to play, like what if. Meanwhile, also in the 1850s, there's a slave by the name of Dred Scott. Now, Dred Scott was in the valet to an army surgeon in Missouri, and he traveled with him. It was a good cushy post. Traveled with him all over the country. And after the surgeon got through traveling all over the country, he returned to Missouri. Now, this is where the story gets a little sticky. It depends on which sources you're using. But we do know that when he returned to Missouri, he sued in the courts, Missouri courts, saying that since he had been in free territory, this made him free. And surprise, surprise, the Missouri courts agreed with him. But of course, his owner wasn't going to let that go, so the owner appealed and went to the Missouri Supreme Court, who overturned it, saying yes, he was still a slave, that just going to free territory didn't matter. Well, now that the Missouri Supreme Court has overturned it, he has in effect lost his case, so the next step is the United States Supreme Court. So the case was presented to them, and they delayed for several years, trying to wait till after the elections of 1856 because they didn't want to make any waves. Then they made their decision. They said that just going to free territory did not make him a slave, a free man, number one. And number two, it was a redundant question because he had no right to sue in the first place, because the privilege of suing was reserved for citizens of the United States, and no black male or female was a citizen. And oh, by the way, that Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. You can take slavery anywhere you want to now. And of course, the South received this with great joy, and Kentuckians looked at it and went, 2 years later, in 1858, a very young Abraham Lincoln decides to challenge the Mr. Douglas, as he was a senator from Illinois, for his little seat in the Senate. There was a series of debates in Illinois, and again, to shorten the story, I will remind you that every year, Lincoln National Park has a recreation of this, if you ever get a chance to go up there. It's during these debates that Congressman Lincoln is going to become known nationwide, and also because everyone's watching Douglas, because Douglas has made no secret of the fact he plans on running for president in 1860. So anyone that's around him or challenges him is going to be on the front page too. It's during these debates that Lincoln's staunch support for anti-slavery became well known, and he also caught the attention of a newly created political party called the Republican Party. Now, Lincoln loses the election, but as I said, it wasn't because he was not elected by the people, because during this time frame, the senators were not elected by popular vote. Legislatures were elected by popular vote, and then the legislatures would appoint the senators. And since the legislature in Chicago or in Illinois was predominantly Democrat, there was no way they were going to choose Mr. Lincoln. They were going to go with a proven winner. So that takes you up to 1860. And it seems like this issue of slavery is just tearing everybody apart. And I can't say it enough. The age of compromise is gone. The age of confrontation has arrived. So the Democrats met in Charleston, South Carolina in April of 1860 and promptly got into a big old hairy argument. Both J.C. Breckinridge, John Breckinridge, and Stephen Douglas's names were put before the convention. Mr. Douglas did not agree with the South's demands, so the people who supported him left. And they went to Baltimore. Okay, fine and dandy. Douglas is nominated in Baltimore through the Democrats, and those that stayed in Charleston nominated John C. Breckinridge. So we've got two parties claiming, or two groups of people claiming to be the Democratic Party. You've got two Democratic candidates. This newly created party that's only been around for about 4 years, Republicans met in the next month in Chicago and nominated Abraham Lincoln. There was also another new party called the Constitutional Union Party. No one had ever heard of it outside of the local people in Tennessee, and they nominated John Bell, their favorite son. So basically, you've got four people. You've got Douglas, Chicago Democrat. You've got Breckinridge, Southern Democrat. You've got Bell, the Constitutional Unionist. You've got Lincoln from the newly created Republican Party, all running the same office. Now, there's nothing wrong with more than two people running, but anytime you split a party, you weaken it. And by the way, of course, Lincoln does win, but he does not win the popular vote. He only had 40% of the popular vote, but he did win the electoral vote. Meanwhile, a year before this, 1859, we in Kentucky had a election, and we elected Worth McCoffin. Now, he is a good man. He's as good as he looks. He's pro-slavery. He's a true Southerner, strong states writer. He's very smart. He really cares about Kentucky, and Sometimes he would have to go against his own personal feelings because he was doing what he thought was best for Kentucky. But he could see the handwriting on the wall, and he was just no way he wanted Kentuckians to get involved in any dispute that might turn into violence. So he sends a letter around to southern states and proposing 6 measures, which are listed in your text, that if they were accepted, it would hold the Union together. And we had several senators or governors and representatives from other government to visit us, but of course they were not here to talk reason. They were here to talk us into secession. Senator Crittenden from Kentucky proposes some constitutional changes, and it seemed like everybody's got an idea of what to do to stop this from being a shooting war. And because if it is, we're going to wind up in the middle. In the 1860 election, of course, Lincoln was elected not by popular vote, but by electoral vote, and Breckinridge was even on the committee that had to count the electoral votes and announce Lincoln's election. Breckinridge took his seat as a U.S. senator, and the other Southern senators that were elected took their seat, but as their states started to secede in the 1861s, they began to leave. South Carolina secedes in December of 1861 because of Lincoln, even though Lincoln said he would do nothing to outlaw slavery in states that it was already legal in. It's a war of words through April of 1861 when Fort Sumter is fired upon. Immediately after that, President Lincoln calls on 75,000 troops to suppress the rebellion. And our Governor McLaughlin said no. Well, actually, he said, quote, "I say emphatically Kentucky will furnish no troops for the wicked purpose of subduing her sister southern states," and issues our neutrality statement. But meanwhile, back in 1860, he passed a law that all white men in the age of 18 to 45 had to enroll in a militia because he got to looking. And, you know, the last thing we wanted to do was have a John Brown episode in our state. So he looks around, our militia's not been doing good, so we need to do something to bring it up to speed. So he gets permission and hires a man called Simon B. Buckner, Simon Boulevard Buckner, I want you to know. Very experienced military man. West Point graduate, a lawyer from Louisville. Wealthy, extremely respected by everyone. Very successful businessman. So he was chosen to train this new state guard, which we'll learn a little bit more about in the next chapter. He trained the men real well, and it was great. Meanwhile, in 1860 also, December, there was a change in command in Fort Sumter, because after South Carolina seceded, she proceeded to take over all the federal bases, and there was only one little fort down there that we still had any federal troops in, called Fort Moultrie. And so they sent Major Anderson, who's a Kentuckian, figuring he would be acceptable because he was from the South and his wife was from the South. His wife was the daughter of a slaveholder. As a matter of fact, she was the godchild of the governor of South Carolina. She didn't go with him, of course, but he went down to be commander, and he wound up realizing he couldn't defend Fort Moultrie, so he takes over Fort Sumter. Well, he wasn't able to hold on to Fort Sumter, and when he had to surrender it, it was called the First Battle of the Civil War in April of 1861 because he ran out of supplies. So when he surrendered to General Beauregard, well, he didn't surrender. Actually, he evacuated the fort. It's a gentleman's war so far. Nobody died during the shelling of Fort Sumter, even though I have a rather elaborate pen and ink drawing, or not pen and ink, but painting of what supposedly happened. It wasn't that bad. Charleston did fire on it for 2 days, and a spare shot actually hit the arsenal, where they keep their where they keep their ammunition, and it exploded. So they were down to just the rounds of ammunition they had on them. So Anderson had no choice but to surrender. But it was not a formal surrender. It was an evacuation of the fort, and the Confederates put them on a ship and sent them where they wanted, back to New York. When he got to New York, of course, he was promoted to general and sent back to Lexington to be in charge of recruiting. Now, the war in Kentucky is called the Brothers' War, and we're a border state. And I've got some reasons listed here why. Because we had ties with the South, because so many of our people who came to Kentucky came from Old Dominion or Virginia. We had slavery. We traded with the South. We resented those abolitionists and their writings telling us that we're not living right, that it's immoral to have slaves. And of course, that Mississippi River and steamboat traffic, I mean, we go down south all the time. So our ties with our southern state sisters are very strong. But we also have ties with the north. A lot of settlers came from Pennsylvania. We have fought many wars with the Unionists, strong Union soldiers. And of course, Henry Clay was a very strong Unionist, and everybody loved him and respected him. And that Ohio River goes north, and we trade with the north. And then we just had some citizens who just plain flat didn't approve of slavery. So you've got families and churches and communities all splitting over the issue of slavery. Yeah, I have a list of names here that we've covered each one of these names just in this few brief minutes. Stephen Douglas, the senator from Illinois. John Brown, the abolitionist who was hung because of the raid at Harper's Ferry. Robert E. Lee, he was a young colonel at the time. He arrested him. John C. Breckinridge, our senator from Kentucky, also vice president. Dred Scott, the young African who sued for his freedom because he was in a free state, and we got the Dred Scott decision stating that the black man wasn't a citizen. Abraham Lincoln, of course, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and the president. Brewer McLaughlin was our governor elected in 1859. Simon B. Butler is the man who your teacher happens to admire very much, in charge of the State Guard organization. George W. Johnson, I have not mentioned yet, and Richard Hawes. Those two names have not been mentioned. James Robinson. So Johnson, Hawes, and Robinson we will talk more about in the next chapter. I've decided not to talk to you about it here, although it's in your text. Johnson is, of course, the Kentucky's first Confederate governor. Richard Hawes is the second Confederate governor. And James Robinson is going to take the place of Brewer McLaughlin when he resigns, which we'll discuss, like I say, in the next chapter. Events: the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Harper's Ferry, Dred Scott decision, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, where Lincoln's views on slavery become known. Now the difference between the State Guard and the Home Guard, which is very simple. The State Guard was pro-Southern, and Buckner was the one who brought them up. The Home Guard was brought up by the legislature to be pro-Union. Now, as I said, you may have noticed there were several incidents mentioned in this chapter I have not covered, like the Confederate Kentucky and her governors, the resignation of the Kentucky's governor, and the 1861 elections in Kentucky. They're going to be discussed in the next chapter, lecture, the Civil War. So take a deep breath and go over in your mind what we've covered. It's a lot of background information. And I've chosen to make this 2 sections because of length and so much information. And I've chosen to try to keep the information about the time frame from the time the war starts in 1861, really starts, all the way through 1865, all at once, even if it means combining some Chapter 13 information along with Chapter 14. To me, it's easier if it's chronological. So I suggest, again, you take a few minutes and go over your notes and do something totally unrelated to your lessons to clear your mind before you go on. Because the next lecture is about the Civil War, and there's lots and lots of information and many different names. Now, I promise you that the lectures will be shorter after the Civil War.